Hey, eighth graders, happy Wednesday. We're going to do day 2 of our Road to Civil War notes today. If you were following along yesterday, we left off right at the Wilmot Proviso, which was the appropriate the new territories acquired from the Mexican-American War. So should they be open to slavery? Should they not? And then having the Senate decide whether or not that would pass, which caused more tension between the North and the South. So we're going to continue going on with that, which will lead to the Compromise of 1850. So if you are keeping track on our typable note template right here, we are, let's see, this is the beginning. We did all of this yesterday. And then we are going to start right here on bullet number 3. So, moving forward, the Compromise of 1850, California entered the Union as a free state. So, the state of California, once that was purchased through the Mexican-American War, or once that was gained from the Mexican-American War, they decided to make it a free state, so no slavery was prohibited in this area. The rest of the Mexican secession was divided into the territories of New Mexico and Utah. In each territory, voters would decide the slavery question according to popular sovereignty. So, based on majority, they would decide whether or not they would be considered a free state or a slave state. The slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C., but Congress declared that it had no power to ban the slave trade between the slave states. So Congress was saying that based on the sectionalism or based on the territory, that was how they would decide whether or not they would ban slavery. A strict fugitive slave law was passed. So we're going to go into that fugitive slave law of 1850 right here. Demanded all citizens help catch runaway slaves. People who let fugitives escape would be fined $1,000 and jailed for 6 months. So this was their solution to making sure that if slave states or slaves in slave states escaped, that people in the free states would return them to their quote unquote owners or masters. So this was their way of saying even if a slave state moves to the location of a free state, that they would be fined and jailed. So this was trying to prohibit that kind of action. Obviously, it was clear that slavery was inhumane, that people were trying to get away from it, and the fact that they were trying to pay people or prohibit them from rescuing or freeing these slaves was just a huge way of trying to prohibit it. So if you look at this sign right here, colored people of Boston, one and all, you are hereby respectfully cautioned, which that sounds respectfully cautioned, kind of like you better do it, advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston, kidnappers and slave catchers. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open. So they were kind of trying to keep the town worried in a kind of like panicky way, saying that colored people obviously should not be trusted, that they are potentially slaves that ran away or escaped. So make sure that they are returned. And right here, you see a sign that was a reward. So if you it's almost like lost pet reward, which is so inhumane and so unbelievably unacceptable. But they were saying, "Oh, return my property," quotes, you will receive $100 reward. So this is kind of what you would see plastered in the North and the free states to try to ensure that nobody was escaping a slave state. So thousands of African Americans fled to Canada for fear of being kidnapped. So obviously they were freed, and even the slaves or even the African Americans that were already living and located in free states still worried that they would be misconstrued as slaves. So they decided to flee to Canada, where there was no slavery happening in any of the territories in that area. So going across the United States lines into Canada, they felt like that would be their safety, their freedom, their new home. So Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a really famous book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm sure that most of you have heard of this in some retrospect. This was kind of the first piece of literacy that talked about the injustice of slavery that was very widespread. So obviously people would write documents, maybe write articles in the newspaper. The newspaper was just beginning to spread more, have more popularity in the North, and was kind of trickling into the South. Think about what we talked about North versus South last week, how a lot of people were not exactly educated or literate. especially farmers from the South. So people having access to books and actually being able to read them was pretty uncommon. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about this. It was written to show the evils of slavery and the injustice of the Fugitive Slave Act, or treating African Americans like all potential slaves and kidnapping them and offering rewards for them. Harriet Beecher Stowe went into this. And in 1852, obviously 2 years after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, this was pretty controversial for people that were in the South and people that believed that slavery should be represented in different states. So this was a huge book. This is something that you can still read today, obviously not as popular as some, because it's, I mean, obviously slavery is not something that is happening in the United States as of right now, but it is a pretty exceptional book. I read certain aspects of it, and it's incredible story. I think we have a picture of it here in this next slide right here. Uncle Tom's Cabin: Life Among the Lowly. It was published in the North, but Southerners claimed it did not accurately portray slavery. So the people that were being kind of crucified or blamed in this book to be these evil representations of the Southerners and the farmers and the plantation owners, obviously were saying, "Oh, whoa, 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 whoa! This is being blown way out of proportion," because this was appealing to people. This was striking a certain passionate chord in people that were reading this book in the North, saying, "Oh my gosh, this is as awful as we always thought it is," and it painted a really, really ugly picture of humanity. So obviously, people are becoming angry, they're becoming passionate, they're becoming to push more against slavery in any state, not just in the South or in the North. So, so obviously, the Southerners went on the defense and they were saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, time out. Harriet Beecher Stowe has no idea what she's talking about. This is not, we treat our slaves with the respect that they deserve," all this stuff. But Stowe had seen little slavery firsthand, but this book helped change the way Northerners felt about slavery. It really struck a chord in something that was definitely very, very evil, and finally people were beginning to realize it. And keep in mind, again, the time period that we were looking at, people were not finding videos of this footage. This was not something that was coming on the evening news. This was not something that people were blowing out of proportion. It was just kind of the way of life where you were. And if it was not happening directly in front of you, the reality of it did not seem to affect you. So just keep that in mind. While this book being a bestseller and being widely distributed was a very, very, very big deal. So the Kansas versus Nebraska Act, this bill would divide the Nebraska territory into Kansas and Nebraska, so dividing it into two, and popular sovereignty would be used to decide the question of slavery. So again, looking at the majority and having that decision be based on the people. However, slavery was already banned by the Missouri Compromise, so this bill would undo the Missouri Compromise. So this is going against the bill that was previously passed and going against what that would be for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Slavery could now spread to areas that had been free for 30 years. So obviously, keep in mind that people were being exposed to this Uncle Tom's Cabin. They were obviously more against it than before, and all of a sudden slavery is appearing right in front of them. And that is very much going to upset people that were very passionate about being a free state and having more equal rights for all. So Kansas explodes. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces sent settlers to Kansas ready to fight for control of their territory. So this is another stepping stone that leads to that strong tension between Northerners and Southerners, the Unions and the Confederates, the pro-slavery versus the anti-slavery. This is just one more notch in what is going to turn into the Civil War. So obviously being able to claim that something was, your territory was free, or if it was a slave state, that was what they were fighting for, being able to determine that for the territory that they lived in. So let's go ahead and look at the notes real quick to see where we are, because I want to make sure that we stop. Right, so we are right here, so we're going to go a little bit further. So this is where we are in the notes as of right now. Make sure that if you need to slow down, go ahead and pause this, look at the PowerPoint, and I will also put this on the answer key when we are done with all these notes all together. So 1,000 abolitionists left New England for Kansas, and pro-slavery bands from Missouri called border ruffians often rode across the border to battle anti-slavery forces. So these people that were like the kind of like soldiers, or like people that were willing to come to fight, come to arms, were considered the border ruffians. When elections were held in 1855, hundreds of border ruffians, that term again, those people that were there to call to arms to answer that, voted illegally and helped elect a pro-slavery legislature. So they crossed the lines into another state that was considered a free state to do what they could to make that territory a slave state. So obviously this was illegal. You were only supposed to vote in the state in which you resided. So they went across the border to vote in another person's polls or another state's or another territory's polls. Think again, elections and voting is not as accurate it is now. You have to bring your license, you have to have citizenship, you have to have proof of address when you vote now. Obviously, this is pretty much you were a white male, you showed up, you voted, and that was that. If someone caught you voting multiple times, you would obviously have a punishment, but the chances of somebody being able to catch you for voting multiple times was unlikely because there was really no way to keep track of that at all the locations that you're polling in. They quickly began to pass laws in support of slavery because these quote unquote border ruffians were crossing over the territory and voting illegally in other states. Anti-slavery forces elected their own governor and legislature. With two rival governments, Kansas was in chaos. So Kansas was completely divided. One side was offering a free state. They had a free state governor. They had someone that supported that in the government. But then the anti-slavery decided that the pro-slavery decided to create their own form of government with somebody that supported their specific desires. So it was kind of like this one state, this one territory, this one section of the United States was born or was being spread apart in two. So you were either having someone that was either supporting your desires or you were incredibly against it and put someone that you decided in government or had an elected governor that was going against it. So whether this was legal or organized, it was definitely not. So it was creating a lot of tension, especially in Kansas. So in response to a drunken pro-slavery attack that destroyed homes and a newspaper, John Brown and his sons went to Potawatomi Creek and killed 5 pro-slavery settlers. So this was becoming more tension. This was becoming bloodshed. So this is another big tipping point that led to that North and Southern pro-slavery, anti-slavery riot and war. Over 200 people were eventually killed, and the newspapers called the territory Bleeding Kansas. So this right here is where we're going to stop today. Continue to think about what is leading up to the Civil War, these events that are taking place, the cause and effect of these events, what's happening in government, what's happening in just day-to-day lives of citizens that are living in different territories, for example, in Kansas and Nebraska and California along the Missouri Compromise line. Think about these things as we go forward. All right, guys, have a wonderful day, and you will hear from me soon.